All one could see was flames. All one could hear was the shattering of glass and the desperate screams of those running for their lives. All one could smell was the smoke from Jewish possessions, stores, and synagogues being burned. On November 9th, 1938, 1,400 synagogues were set on fire in Nazi Germany in what has come to be known as Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. Tonight, learning from the past and looking to the future, a story of triumph with Mrs. Eva Schloss, commemorating 80 years since Kristallnacht.
Good evening. On behalf of the hosting committee, I am honored to welcome all of you to this historic evening with Eva Schloss. This meaningful event is part of New York Hebrew's B'nai Mitzvah program and curriculum. And as any parent knows who is fortunate enough to have a child at New York Hebrew, as I am, Mrs. Gilly and Rabbi Mendy Shanowitz and their dedicated teachers and staff strive to prepare our children for a purposeful adult life. We know that this evening's event will serve as a compass for them. This past summer, I had the opportunity to travel through Eastern Europe with my 10-year-old daughter, Mira. Walking the cobblestone streets of the old Jewish quarter in Vienna, where my great-grandparents lived, and throughout all the cities we visited, we looked down and saw the names of Holocaust victims inscribed in brass in front of where they last lived. We also saw tourists smiling for selfies at Holocaust memorials. These moments solidify the meaning of never forget. And it is these moments, including being lucky enough to all be here together tonight, that make us realize just how important it is to remind, to remember, to reflect, to mourn, and then to celebrate that we are all here and present and able to make a difference. Thank you to Rabbi Naftali Ruttenstreich, the founder of New York Hebrew and Chabad Center for Jewish Discovery, and thank you to our sponsors, to the Solomon House, and to our school patrons, Avenues World School, Friends Seminary, and Lemon Manhattan. This event is dedicated in loving memory of Dr. Lawrence Resnick. Thank you all for being here and helping to make this momentous event possible. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Rabbi Mendy.
Ladies, gentlemen, and dear friends, 80 years ago tonight, on the 16th day of the Jewish month of Cheshvan, the Holocaust began. Known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, hundreds of synagogues were vandalized and destroyed. Over 8,000 Jewish shops were sacked and looted, and tens of thousands of Jews were transported to concentration camps, most of whom never were to return. And here we are tonight, exactly 80 years later, for a historic gathering. The words and stories we hear this evening will stay with us for decades. In time, it will be us in this room who will bear the responsibility to transmit them to the next generation. Which leads me to make special mention of the youth, the students, who are here with us in the audience tonight. You being here ensures that our story will continue for generations to come. But friends, in addition to carrying on the story and never forgetting, I wish, I hope, and I pray that tonight's event will actually make us better people. As we reflect upon the Holocaust that began 80 years ago tonight, my late mentor, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, would say that from the Holocaust, we need to learn to be more conscious of and recommit ourselves to treasuring, respecting, and honoring that divine gift of life endowed to each one of us by God Almighty. Yes, each and every one of us, irrespective of our beliefs and race, is fashioned in His image. He has bestowed onto us this gift of life, and He, and only He, can take it away from us. And in this way, we will indeed merit to live in the world the prophets envisioned, a world of peace, a world in which nations shall not lift the sword against nation, with the coming of the final redemption. Amen. Please direct your attention to the screens.
Dark clouds began to cover the skies of Europe, the clouds of Nazism. And as they invaded Warsaw, they moved Jews, men, women, and children into the ghettos. Slowly, over time, the ghettos began to empty. Even the birds stopped singing, as if they knew what came next. The trains of doom filled with the innocent and the pure, carrying them to their deaths. And it was on one such train headed to the death camp Treblinka, in the midst of the terror, the gasping, the weeping, and the despair, that a lone voice was heard singing. His name was Azriel David Fastig, the cantor of the saintly Moznitzer Rebbe, Rabbi Shaul Yedidya Elisar. People thought he had lost his mind, but Azriel's heavenly and sweet voice continued its soulful tune. There he was, face aglow, eyes closed in concentration as he sang the words of the Ani Ma'amin, I believe declaration. As if harmonizing with the angels, he sang devotedly of the nation's undying faith that the world would one day be a place of universal peace, tranquility, and human dignity. Gradually, the hundreds of listening ears joined his song, at first quietly, but slowly growing louder and louder. Soon the song spread from car to car, and every mouth that could still draw a breath joined in Azriel's haunting melody, Ani Ma'amin. His eyes red from crying and his cheeks wet with tears, Cantor Fastig tore a piece off of his own shirt and jotted down the notes of his new composition. There he proclaimed, I will give half my share in the world to come to the person who will take my song to my saintly teacher, the Moznitzer Rebbe, who had escaped to the shores of the United States. A hushed silence descended upon the train, and two young men appeared, promising to bring the song to the Rebbe at any cost. Bidding farewell to their brothers and sisters, they jumped out of a hole they broke in the train's roof. One miraculously survived, and clutching dearly to the shirt, kept the melody alive. It was on Yom Kippur, just after the war, on the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, and the Moznitzer Rebbe's synagogue in New York was filled with thousands upon thousands. As the Rebbe began singing the Ani Ma'amin, the crowd wept bitterly, swaying back and forth as if in a different world. He trembled and declared, On their journey to the gas chambers, this song was born from the ashes of millions. And it is through this song that their voices shall continue to be heard, beckoning us to carry forth the torch of human decency until all of God's children are touched by its light.
Ani Bevios HaMoshiach Ani Ma'amin Ve'af al pi She'yisma me've'ah Yim kol ezeh Ani Ma'amin Ani Ma'amin Bevios HaMoshiach Ani Ma'amin Ve'af al pi She'yisma me've'ah Yim kol ezeh Ani Ma'amin
Thank you, Cantor Hershtig from the Hampton Synagogue. Ladies and gentlemen, Ani Ma'amin. Under the harshest and unimaginable conditions, we continue to believe. And here tonight, we have an individual who has dedicated her life to lifting the spirits of audiences the world over, a survivor in the truest sense of the word, a builder, a healer, and a model of endurance. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming from London, England, Mrs. Eva Schloss, who will share her story in conversation with New York Hebrews director, Mrs. Gili Shanowitz.
Mrs. Schloss, we're so honored to have you here tonight. We've been eagerly awaiting to hear your story. so let's get right to it.
That's right, because we have a lot to talk about.
That's right. So, you grew up in Vienna, in Austria. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, your family life as a young girl?
Yes, well, as I say, if you've heard, I was born in Vienna, which was a beautiful city. It was an imperial city, and my parents had been living there forever, and their grandparents, so we were really Viennese. We were, of course, Jewish, but not particularly Orthodox. But it was important that in Austria, every child had to have religious education in the school. So at the time when I was 7 years old, I had, there were about 7 Jewish children in our class. We were called out of our class. We went to a different classroom and we had Jewish education, meaning we learned a little bit of Hebrew, we learned the Bible story, the Old Testament, and the Catholic children stayed in their class and they had the New Testament. And then we came back and nobody minded, it was accepted, we were accepted, there was no difference. We mixed with Christian and Jewish people, nobody asked what religion you had. And,
but then the mood changed. Hitler marched into Austria. Can you tell us what happened?
Unexpectedly, he marched into Austria. And suddenly, even our friends, everybody stood in the street with where they got suddenly those swastika flags, I don't know. They stood waving the flags and always the Heil Hitler salute, and they went completely mad welcoming Hitler. And the Jewish people, of course, knew what had happened already in Germany, so we were very, very scared.
Something prompted your father to say, we have to get out of here, we have to escape. There was an incident with your brother Heinz.
Well, my brother came home from school next day, you know, he came home and he was completely beaten up, the blood was streaming from his nose and he looked terrible. And my parents questioned him, what on earth has happened? And he said, my own friends did that, and the teachers just watched let it happen.
So your father said, that's it, we have to
leave.
And so you
But it was not so easy, you know. So my father, he had business contact in Holland. He disappeared right away, thinking, you know, because you couldn't take anything with you. And, you know, you can't just leave your home from one day to the next. My grandparents were there, my sister of my mother, and, you know, you just didn't want to leave your family and just go. And so my father said, well, once I'm settled, I hope you can follow. But this was really the problem. So that a few months later, most countries in the world had closed their doors for Jewish refugees.
But you escaped. You had managed to escape to Holland.
Well, first through Belgium, and eventually we settled in Amsterdam. So quite late, you know, the war was already started. Hitler had already gone into Czechoslovakia and Poland, and France and England declared the war. But there was no fighting anywhere, you know, because there was no common border, really. And so it was a very difficult situation for everybody. You know, people didn't really know where to go, what to do. It was panicky, really panic situation.
But when you got to Amsterdam, you were able to settle down a little bit, and that's where you met a young lady, Anna Frank. She became a bit famous.
She became very famous. I'm sure all of you have heard the name.
But,
most of you have read the diary as a young girl.
But you knew her not just through the pages of her diary. You really knew her. Could you give us a little bit of a picture as what she was like as a girl, as a student? What was she like?
Well, you know, we were both 11 years old. And of course, as you say, she wasn't famous. So she became just one of my playmates. And through my experience, I had become shy, so that wasn't in my nature. And she was very, they left already when Anna was 4 years old in 1933. It was Otto Frank, her father, who realized when he saw the Nazis marching through the street, a very famous Nazi song, when Jewish blood drips from our knives, everything will be better. And Otto Frank said, that is not a country. So he was very patriotic. He was an officer in the First World War. And it was hard to suddenly leave his own country. But he said, this is not a country where I want to bring up a family. So Anne was only 4 years old when they settled in Amsterdam. So she learned Dutch, of course, immediately. And she only spoke Dutch. And so when we met, she asked me where I came from. And I said, from Austria. Oh, you speak German? I will take you to my apartment to meet my dad, who will speak German to you. And this is how I got to know the family. Of course, never expecting how close we would become later on.
I can imagine.
Yeah, you know, that was something I could never have imagined.
As a student, what was she like? I mean,
well, she went actually to a Montessori school, meaning that Otto Bastos realized she's not just an ordinary child, she needs a bit more attention. She hates to do maths and certain, some people hate. I was actually very good at that. But she loved, so we were quite opposite. She loved writing stories and chatting a lot. Her nickname was Mrs. Quack Quack. She never could stop talking. She had to stay behind in school to write 100 lines. I'm not going to talk so much in class, but she just couldn't help it. And so, you know, and in that school, in the Montessori school, they could do really what they liked, and this suited her. And so Otto told me later she had no idea about additions or subtraction. She just didn't want to learn that, and she didn't. But stories that is what she really loved. Of course, later she got the diary, but not till much later.
Right, so we're actually going to get to that part.
I didn't know really that she got a diary, because that was actually...
Right,
we're going
to get to that. We're going to talk about that later on.
But I just want to tell you, she, with 11 years old, was already very interested in boys. And when I told her I had an older brother, he said, when can I come to your apartment? But nothing came of this.
Oh my. So it sounds like a very happy experience that you were having in Amsterdam, even though you had escaped from Austria and you had a lot of adjustment.
But we started to settle down, you know. Right. We didn't bring anything. And so my father, and that is very important, my father hired a furnished apartment. That was a lady who, very luxurious, there was a big piano in there as well, and very beautiful. But the lady had escaped before the Nazis came in to Switzerland, where her son was living. And so she had sold the apartment to a non-Jewish person, and this person tried to find a tenant, and my father was a tenant.
Wow, but eventually...
We will talk about this a little bit later.
Yeah, but eventually, unfortunately, the Germans invaded Holland as well, and life changed.
Very quickly.
You had to...
We had just 3 months of peace.
3 months of peace. And then you and the Franks and many other people had to go into hiding. Can you tell us what that was like to go into hiding?
Well, I just want to tell a little bit more, because at first nothing really happened. And we thought, well, this is going to be okay. They won't do anything in the occupied countries. But then the measures against Jewish people started to come. So it was first just a nuisance, you know. We were not allowed to go out before 8 o'clock in the morning, and we had to be in at 8 o'clock in the evening. We had to give in our bicycles. We had to give in our radios. We were not allowed on public transport. We were not to go to the cinema or theaters, swimming pools. So for us children, you know, we were upset, but it was not life-threatening. But then we had to leave our schools and go to Jewish schools. You will say, well, what's wrong with that? There was nothing wrong with it. Only the Nazis knew there are lots of Jewish children, and they came with trucks and told the children to go on the truck, and the children never were seen again. The parents went to the police trying to find out where are the children, why didn't they come home? Nobody gave them any information. And only after the war did we hear those children were sent to Mauthausen, a horrific Austrian death camp, and they were just thrown down from the cliffs. You can imagine. you know, but just the children disappearing, that was already a terrible event. And then after 2 years occupation, in June 1942, about 10,000 young people, I'm sure there are a lot of them of you here, 16 years old and a bit older, got a call-up notice to be deported to Germany. That was my brother Heinz, who had just turned 16, and Anne's sister Margot. And that is when my father called us together and said, Heinz, we are not sending you, but we are going into hiding. And, you know, I couldn't understand to go into hiding. That was something I couldn't imagine. And my father explains he found some wonderful people, Dutch people, who risked their life to take us in their own homes. But he didn't find a family who could take in 4 people because the apartments are quite small, so we have to split up. And I will go with mother and Heinz will go with him. And I started to cry. I didn't want to be separated. I was very much attached to my brother and my father. And my father explained, if we're in 2 different places, the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. So survive. So I realized it might be a matter of life and death. And that is for a 13-year-old, or for everybody, quite scary.
Can I imagine, how long were you in hiding?
We were in hiding for 2 years. And you know, in 1942 we went into hiding and we said, you know, terrible, we don't want to, and why, and this and that. And my father said, it won't be long. You know, America was already in the war, and really we hoped the war would end soon. My father said, by Christmas it will all be over. But it lasted another good 2 years, more 3 years actually. And so the hiding, of course, we had to be quiet, like you and me sat there. We had to take our food there. We had to take a potty there, even so we wouldn't go to the toilet. And the Nazis made house searches because they really wanted to catch every Jew. So at night they came, knocked on the door. People had to open. If they fancied a picture or a candlestick or whatever, they just took it. So you can imagine the Dutch really started to hate the Germans. And they searched the homes. So in every hiding place, we had a hiding place within the hiding place. Meaning, again, the people from the resistance came and looked over the apartment and brought in material and made false partition. So they made the room smaller. And so in this space, we had to quickly go when we heard this knock. And we heard, for instance, a story in another apartment. The same thing happened. The people, it was always at night, went quickly to this hiding place, but the beds were still warm. So they demolished the whole apartment till they found the people. And of course, the host people were taken away as well. So if you hear those stories, people became scared and said, you have to find a different hiding place.
Right, and eventually, after being in hiding for 2 years, on your 15th birthday, that really changed your life. What happened that day?
Well, that was something I will never ever forget, as you can imagine. We just had moved as well to a different hiding place, and it was actually people we had known, and they made a special birthday breakfast for me. It was 11th of May, 1942, my 15th birthday. And we just sat down with an egg, which was very special. You only get 1 egg a week. So they just kept that for us. And knock on the door, and the Nazis stormed in and went straight for me and my mother. The son of the house, he escaped over the roof because they would have taken him as well. And we were arrested.
And then you were arrested, and then where did they take you from? You were in prison for overnight.
We take it
and
to
then where they called your name,
prison,
and where did they take you?
At prison, and then the next day we went to, it was about 2 hours, still in a normal kind of train, to a holding camp called Westerbork in the north of Holland. If we would have been able to stay there, we would certainly, all 4 of us, have survived. But I must still tell that my father and brother was arrested as well. So this that 2 of us will survive if we were separate didn't really help, because this is a long story. I'm afraid we won't have time to explain it all.
Not at all.
But
not all of it, but
it is amazing how it was. I just tell this. It was a Dutch nurse who was a double agent. She really pretended she worked for the resistance, but she really was a Nazi spy.
And that's how your family was
And that's how we were caught. And after the war, there was a court case against her, and she put 2,000 people to her death, and she only got 4 years.
Wow. So
in this holding camp...
In this holding camp, they took you from there, and they sent you...
As I say, if we would have stayed there, my whole family would have left. But the commander was actually Jewish. But the Germans were supervising this camp. But the Germans told this commander, usually every week, I need a list with 800 people, 900 people, 700 people to go to transport. So this Jewish man had to decide who he was going to put on this list to send to, probably to their death. Can you imagine?
To concentration camps.
Yeah.
So,
and so as we had just arrived new, we were of course put immediately on the list.
And then they took you.
And you might have seen pictures of those terrible transportation. It was not trains for humans. It was, well, you can call it cattle truck or containers. It was really like a container, just with a little slit, with a little bit of air for 80 people. Can you imagine? There was practically no air. It was very hot. We got 2 buckets. One was clean water, the other one to use for toilets for 80 people. Once a day they changed that. Then at the same time they threw big chunks of bread in, like you would feed wild animals. Not enough food, of course, for 80 people. But that was the last time that we were together as a family.
So you arrived at Auschwitz and you were separated. You and your mother were separated from your father and your brother Heinz. What did your father tell you before you were separated? What was the last thing he said to you?
Well, this was the most horrible thing, that families were separated. So you can imagine the atmosphere, mothers and sons saying goodbye, fathers and daughters, couples saying goodbye, perhaps never ever seeing each other alive. So my father, who was not a very religious man, took me by the hands and said, God will protect you. You know, he, in the cattle truck, he apologized that from now on he can't look after us anymore. That must have been for him a really, really terrible thing. You know, the head of a family not being able to look after his family. And in the camp he knew he's powerless now, so he gave me over to God to look after him.
So as you mentioned, we could stay, I think we could stay and listen to you all night if we could, but unfortunately we are a little limited in time. So can you share with us, what was your worst memory being in Auschwitz, in this concentration camp you just arrived to? What was your worst memory of your experience and your time there?
Well, you know, we were in shock, as you can imagine. And so the first day was really the most horrendous day, because a selection was taking place. Mengele, the camp doctor, came and looked you over just for a fraction of a second and decided life or death. We lost half of our Dutch transport, all the children and older people. It wasn't a matter of age, but just how you looked. And those people marched away, and we were herded like sheep into a barrack. The next command, undressed completely naked. We were tattooed, our hair was shaved, and while this was going on, they told us, and this is what I object most, with so much cruelty and laughing, they told us that the family you had been separated from are already murdered, they were already gassed. So can you imagine a mother who had just been separated from her child? So, and people cried, and we were so desperate. We didn't know what is going to happen. Were we going as well going to be killed and so on? So the first day was horrendous. I wouldn't say we get used to it, but it became routine. Every day was the same. In the morning, you stood up, a roll call for 2 hours. You got a little bit of liquid. Then you were taken to work. Hours and hours and hours, hard labor. You had no tools. You had a little hammer. You had to divide rocks. You had to carry heavy boulders around. Very often useless work. And my mother said she walked behind me, saw me bent over with this rock, and she, burst into tears. She said, "My little Evertje, what she has to go through." And the mother was helpless to help me. And then the worst thing happened. One day when we were full of lice, and once a week we were deloused. So naked again, we went to a shower, and there stood this Dr. Mengele, and a selection was taking place. From time to time this happened. And so we had to parade naked in front of him, turn around, and then he decided again, you go there or you go there. I followed a lot of our groups, and I went to the good side, and my mother followed, and he looked her over and put her to the wrong side. I ran to her to say goodbye, and one of those couples with a huge stick beat me over the back and separated us. So not even letting us say goodbye when my mother was going to be killed. But a miracle happened.
Yes, and I was going to ask you, there were so many times where you talk about in your story where it really seemed like you weren't going to make it, but yet, thank God, you're here with us tonight. There were so many miraculous stories that happened. Can you tell us a little bit about that, maybe continuing?
Well, you might have heard that my mother married Otto Frank, so she obviously wasn't killed. And that was really an amazing coincidence. One day, when I had an attack of typhus, rather in the beginning, my mother said, I have to go to the hospital where perhaps she can get some medication for me. And people warned her, don't take Eva to the hospital because nobody comes there out alive. But my mother nevertheless took me. And going there, just when we were near the door, a woman comes out, and my mother looks at her, stock still, and then they run into each other's arms. And it was my mother's cousin and her best friend who lived actually in Prague, because Vienna and Prague were very, very closely connected. And they had been transported, she and her husband, from Theresienstadt, a camp in Prague, and was transported to Auschwitz. And her husband was a doctor and worked in the men camps with the Nazis and knew Mengele, and he got her a job in the hospital. And so this called Minnie, and she gave me, my mother, some medication which saved me at the time. And when my mother was selected in the night, I still was able to run to where she was sleeping and told her what has happened. And then I was moved to a different part of the camp. So I was sure that my mother had been killed. But this Minnie saved her. That's a long story, we can't go into that, but she was saved. And the next miracle was, it was winter, it was very, very cold, the snow was that high. Very often in the snow when you run, you lost your shoe, and I had terrible open toes with frostbite and wounded open, and I couldn't have made it much longer. And I was mentally, many of our Dutch people had disappeared because the Germans knew that the Russians were approaching. We had no idea what was going on with the war. But the Germans took every day, they emptied barracks and the people disappeared. And so I had no people I had known anymore from Holland, and I thought my mother had been killed, and I could hardly walk anymore. I was frozen, I was starving, and I was working, and a couple came and said, somebody wants you outside. So I said, oh, well, that's it now. And I go outside, and there stood my father. This is something just, I can't believe you how amazing it was. That has never ever happened that a man came to, and how he knew where I was, I don't know. And of course we embraced, and the first question I said, how is Heinz? He said, he's okay. How is Mutti?
Your mother?
My mother. And I told him she has been gassed. My father, he just collapsed. I could see he became ashen white and started to cry, and we fell into each other's arms. It was terrible. And then he said, well, don't give up, don't give up. Mutti will look after us. She's protecting you. And soon the war is finished, we'll be together, Heinz and you and me. And I saw him still 3 times, and then I never saw him anymore. And then more people disappeared with the Nazis. Many, many guards escaped as well. It was there was no work anymore. We just walked around. And there were many camps, A, B, C, D. And some people from the Dutch transport came to where I was. And they said, they'd seen my mother. Of course, I didn't want to believe it. I thought they were just trying to cheer me up. But they said, yes, yes, she's there, and your cousin Minnie is hiding her. So that must be true then, I thought. And you said, try to go to this part of the camp. They told me where it was. And after several days, I was able to go there. And indeed, my mother was there. So you can imagine there's a reunion.
That was great.
This was, of course, and I told her I'd seen my father, and Heinz was okay. But I told her as well that I had told my father that she would have been gassed. Anyway.
So you and your mother eventually, you were
then,
liberated.
Then the Germans one day disappeared. But again, a luck that we stayed in Auschwitz, which you would think is a contradiction, that saved our lives. If we would have gone with the Germans, we would certainly not have made it. But we stayed behind, and suddenly one day the Russians came. So this is 27th of January, the liberation of Auschwitz, which is celebrated in Europe very, very much. A big official at one of those occasions, the English Queen came to see all the Holocaust survivors and asked where we had been, in which camp, and spoke with everybody. Right. So that was really very, very moving event.
Right. I mean, after you were liberated, everyone was, you were looking for your families. You met up with Otto Frank, who was also trying to find out about his family. You were trying to find out about your father and brother. So can you tell us about how did people find out what had happened to their families?
Well, first in the camp, of course, I went to the men camp to try to find my father and brother. And I met Otto Frank there. And of course, the first question was, have you seen my children? But we hadn't seen them, or his wife. And then the Russian took us, that was January, February, and the war was not finished till May, so we couldn't get home yet. So the Russian took us away, and Poland was fierce, fierce fighting. And many, many, many people in the Poles were killed, and they burned down the whole old city of Warsaw. And so they evacuated us to Odessa. And eventually, in June, so we traveled for 4 months. Always we had no money, we had no clothes, Eventually we ended up in Amsterdam in June 1945. And we were lucky because I told you we had this furnished apartment which belonged to a Christian, and they let us move in again. But all the other people had really nowhere to go. So Otto Frank, who had traveled with us, went to stay with Miep Gies, who was one of the helpers in the secret annex. And then we went from door to door for where people had come back. We went to the station to see if people had returned. We put adverts in the paper. And eventually Otto heard from 2 women who had been in Bergen-Belsen, that's another camp where the girls were taken from Auschwitz, that they had died from typhus in April, just a little bit before the British Army liberated that camp. And we got a letter from the Red Cross saying that both my father and brother, they gave the names even, Erich and Heinz Geringer. How they knew the names, I don't know. Perished in Mauthausen, this terrible Austrian death camp, several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. Well, this was for me the last straw. I had survived a lot of luck, but as well, I never ever gave up hope. And I thought, well, eventually we'll be a family again, and eventually life will go back to how it used to be. But when I realized that can never ever happen again, I became very, very depressed. And I hated everybody, not just the Nazis, but the whole world, because I realized if we would have been able to go to a different country like England or America, then we would have been all alive. So I became very, very bitter.
Yes, well, you also, when you found out about your family and Otto found out about his family, he actually came to visit you. He came with a package with him, and he showed you that package. Can you tell us what he showed you and what was discovered at that point?
Well, it was a little packet. Of course, you couldn't get paper or anything, and with string. And he opened it really very carefully, and he said, I must use something amazingly what I got. And eventually he undid it, and it was a little checked book on his diary. And he said, can I read you something out of it? We said, of course. And he read the passage, but he always burst into tears. It was so emotional to him. And it took him 3 weeks to read it. He just couldn't get through it. And then he copied it all in German and sent it to his mother, who had lived already for a long time in Switzerland, much more before the Hitler time. And so he wanted to share it with her. But as well, he wanted to go to see his mother and his sister, who was in Switzerland. And we didn't get papers. We were treated as enemies. Because we were German and Austria, so we had to check all what we have done in the war, what has happened. It was amazing, There was so much suspicion, and so it was really horrible. And as well, my grandparents had escaped, and they lived in England. And when they heard that my mother became a widow and lost their son, they were desperate to come and be together my mother wanted to see her mother, and her mother wanted to be with her daughter. And no, you can't travel. You can't go to Holland. They couldn't come to us, and we couldn't go and visit them. That was, after the war, when we thought we will be treated with respect and we will be helped, there was no help. This was really very, very hard. And I was full of hatred, and I didn't want to go to school. But Otto Frank came to me and my mother, and he said, if you live with hatred, you will have such a miserable life. And that was true, I was very, very miserable. I had nightmares, couldn't sleep. I couldn't make friends with my schoolmates. When they had a party, I never went. And so it was really very, very sad. And my mother wrote a letter to her mother. Eva is so sad, so miserable, and I don't know how to cheer her up. And because I'm miserable myself, I have to be for her a mother, a father, and a brother. And the time after the war was perhaps even more difficult than Auschwitz, because in Auschwitz we had one purpose: to try to survive. But then, why had we survived? Life is terrible. And then eventually, when I finished school, I didn't know what to do. I was still very, very depressed. And Otto would come very often to our house. My mother helped him with debating about what to do with the diary. Shall we have it translated? Which language is important? So it was translated into German and French and English. And only when it was published in America in 1952 did it become a bestseller. Because before, people in Europe, didn't really want to hear anything about that. But in America, people started in the 50s be very, very interested. And Otto decided, and my mother decided I should become a photographer. And I didn't really care, I said, okay. And Otto, who was a very good photographer, he took many, many pictures with his girls. There was even once an exhibition of all those photos. And he said, well, I have no family anymore. I'm not going to take any more pictures. And he gave me his Leica, which was one of the best cameras in existence. And I knew somebody in London who had a photographic studio. And I went for a year to become an apprentice. And I lived in a little boarding house where a young man from Israel had come to study economics. And we both didn't have much money, and we went for long walks. We didn't tell them each other who we were. I said I was Dutch, which I wasn't. At the time I was still stateless. He said he was an Israeli. He was actually a German refugee. And but we didn't talk. I didn't say I was in a concentration camp. He didn't say anything. But he was just a student, and I was an apprentice. And after 6 months, he said to me, Eva, I fall in love with you. Will you marry me? And when I'm finished my studying, we can go to Israel and start a new life. And I said, no, thank you.
How very polite.
And, I was, as you can imagine, I was so close to my mother, I could never imagine that I would just go off and get married. And then Otto Frank, he kept a bit eye of me, and he was actually very much before the war, he wasn't very religious, but after the war, he was very much involved with a liberal movement. And there was a congress in London, and he came to this liberal congress, and of course to visit me. And I told him, a young man has asked me to marry him, but of course I said no. And then he said, well, your mother and me have fallen in love as well. Well, I was away, and once you get settled, we like to get married. So I went back to this young man and said, you can marry me now. And he was very happy. And so we went to Amsterdam, because in England we didn't know many people, and we got married in 1952. And Otto and my mother got married in 1953, a year later. And I was married with my unknown husband for 62 years. And when I tell that in schools, I mention that, and they say, with how many husbands? And I said, no, just one. And I can't believe that, because unfortunately so many people have now 2, 3 husbands. Well, so, and we have 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren.
Wow. Well, Eva, unfortunately the time is running, but one last question. Your brother Heinz was a musician, a very talented musician, but when he went into hiding, like you mentioned, you weren't allowed to make noise because you didn't want to get caught.
That's
so he took up another hobby, and he started doing something else. Can you tell us about that, and then tell us what that led to after the war?
Right. Well, of course, in hiding, we had to be very, very quiet. He couldn't make any music. So my father said to him, why don't you try some painting? And Heinz said, well, I'm not a painter, I can't do that. He said, well, let's just try. So he said, I'll start as well. So they both did, and they made amazing artwork. But before this, you might not quite get this, they were blackmailed where they were staying in their last hiding place, and they escaped from there. But before they escaped from there, and that was the last conversation I had with Heinz in the cattle truck, actually. He told me before they escaped from this person, they hid the paintings under the floorboard with a note on it. This belongs to Heinz and Erich Geiringer, and after the war, we are going to pick it up again. And after Otto got the diary, I said to my mother, we have to go and get the paintings. Of course, we were very reluctant to go to this house to confront this woman who's, through her, all these terrible things happened to us. But luckily, she had disappeared. So there were a young couple living there. And first, they didn't even want to let us in. They said, we talk rubbish, to paintings under their floorboards, didn't believe it. But they let us in because I started to cry. And indeed, we found these paintings. And when my mother was alive, she had them 30 artworks, and then later I got them. But I wanted many people to know about Heinz's life and about his artwork. So I donated it to the Resistance Museum. That is the people who really helped many, many Jews and helped us as well in a way. So, and this is where they really are. But we have made copies, and some of them are in the lobby. So when you go later outside, please do look at them. And he was not a schooled painter, but he did really amazing artwork. And all fantasy, all the things he did was not something he could copy or see. He had the most amazing imagination. And as well, he wrote about 200 poems. And most of them are a little bit connected with this. And just one little more minute, I just want to tell you, being so artistic, when he was 12 years old, he was and many people had disappeared, you heard of people being killed. He was very much afraid of dying. And so one day he said to me, what will happen when we die? And I said, well, I don't know, let's ask our father, who has all the questions. And so he went in the morning and he said, Papi, what will happen when we die? And my father said, well, of course, your body will integrate, but if you have children, you will live on in the children. And then he said, but what if I die before I have any children? And my father thought a moment and he said, well, even if you had a short life, whatever you have done in your short life, somebody will remember. We are all a link in a chain which goes from generation to generation. Nothing gets lost. And he had to accept that. And so, because I want him to be not to be forgotten, I do this with paintings. But as well, I wrote a book called The Promise. That is a promise from my father to Heinz that he won't be forgotten.
He won't. Mrs. Schloss, honestly, I'm speechless. You spend your life now empowering people and going to audiences across the globe. We each wish you much continued health and strength to continue spreading your message. And we hope that you continue doing this for many more years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Eva Schloss.
Thank you.
Mrs. Schloss, the patron schools of tonight's event have each chosen a representative from their schools, and we're going to start the Q&A segment with each of these 4 representatives, each one representing one of our patron schools.
Oh,
so,
wonderful. That's
yes,
wonderful.
So we're going to call up for the first question. We're going to call up Amnon Zacharia.
I'm aware that the Holocaust is a very difficult topic for anyone to discuss, especially survivors. However, I was curious as to why you decided to not speak about the Holocaust for so many years, and what caused you to change your mind. Why did you decide to remain silent, even though your stepfather dedicated his entire life to making the story of Anne Frank known?
Well, the diary is not really a Holocaust book, you know. Anne had to stop, unfortunately, writing once she was arrested. So she hadn't experienced in her writing what was happened really in the camp. So, and I was silent because when I came back, I really wanted to talk. I wanted to share my experience with people. I thought people have to know. But, you know, everybody had suffered, and people wanted to move on. And the motto, never again Auschwitz, that's what the people believed. But, and you know, we don't have to learn, we know, never again will anything like that happen again. We will change the world, but we haven't. So, and
What made you decide to start saying your story eventually?
well, I was sort of, so I didn't want to speak, and all the Holocaust survivors had to suppress it, and then 20 years later, when they started to question, we were not ready anymore. And in Amsterdam, of course, in the Anne Frank house, historian decided not everybody can come and visit the house to hear the story, so they made a traveling exhibition. And the first one came to England in 1986. And of course, I was invited to attend that. And the organizer asked me to sit with him on the top table, and I just sat there. And then in the end, he said, now, Eva, we want to talk to you. Well, I didn't. I wanted to hide under the table. But, you know, a big audience sat there looking at me, and I got up, and everything that I had suppressed for 40 years came flooding out. And that was for me a very, very important moment, because I realized the world wants to know, wants to learn. And from then on, I have not stopped speaking.
My name is Roni Zilberman, and I'm in 7th grade, and I'm proud to represent Avenues the World School. My question is, what gave you the strength to keep fighting during your time in the concentration camp?
You know, I was 15 years old, and I really didn't want to die. And this is really quite important, you know, because I had a very, very good youth. And so I wanted to experience life as well. I saw how happy my parents were, and you know, I wanted to have a boyfriend, I wanted to get married, especially I wanted to have a family, have children. And so I never ever gave up hope. But I must admit, I was one of the lucky ones. And perhaps I was protected by God. Perhaps the wish of my father had come true.
Guten Abend, Frau Schloss. My name is Elias Tejpal. I'm in 6th grade, and I'm proud to represent the B'nai Mitzvah students of New York Hebrew. My question is, the number they tattooed on your arm when you got to Auschwitz, how did it make you feel then, and how does it make you feel now?
Good question. You know, when I was tattooed, at that time tattoo was not popular at all. I couldn't... I was shocked that they were going to write on my arm with needles, you know. But, you know, I was in shock anyway. Your hair was shaved and everything. And there were people later who had it removed. But we never even considered this. And, you know, there are still Holocaust deniers who deny that the Holocaust has happened. And if anybody would confront me, I would show him the number. And do you think I put this number there myself? It is something I'm actually proud of. I got it, and I survived. So the Nazis didn't want me to survive, but I did. So I won.
Thank you.
My name is Dylan Blackman. I'm in 10th grade, and I'm proud to represent my school, Lamar Manhattan Preparatory School. As a result of all that you've experienced, what are you able to say about humanity? Are you optimistic about the future?
Well, Anne says in her diary, she still believes in the goodness of mankind. And I was actually disputing this all the time. I said, if she would have lived after she had experienced what those Nazis and those kapos, those were mainly Polish prisoners who were really the most cruel people you can imagine. If she would have experienced that, would she still have believed that? So I think we are born with a little bit of goodness and a little bit of bad in us, and it depends which side we develop. And I have experienced, since I've been talking, I've experienced some amazing, wonderful people. So, and especially, you know, I've got 5 young, they're not so young anymore as grandchildren, but they are from 18 to 30, and they're all very, very working for peace, for, at Christmas they work in field kitchen to help the homeless people. You know, they're decent people, and they really work for changing the world and promoting harmony and peace. So I'm optimistic that eventually we will get the message that wars don't help anybody. Prejudice, you could be prejudiced against. It can happen against a Jew, against a Muslim, against a Christian. We all get the turn to be prejudiced against. So we shouldn't be prejudiced against anybody, and especially not any religious, because religion is a very personal thing. If you pray to this God or to that God, that is nobody's business, as long as we are decent.
Thank you so much.